Hey guys, Scarlett here. I hope you all are doing well. So last week I sent a message out on Instagram and my YouTube community page that I wanted you to send me your questions about paganism. So today I will be answering some of the questions that you sent me. So thanks to all of you guys that did send me a question, and unfortunately I probably won't be able to tackle all of the questions you sent, but maybe I'll do a part 2 down the road so I can hope to answer even more of the questions you guys have about paganism. So if you are new to my channel, welcome. I create weekly videos about topics like tarot, paganism, and magic. And for my returning subscribers, welcome back, guys. So let's jump right into the video. The first question I have here comes from Obella B on Instagram, and she asks, what's your favorite pagan movies, books, and music? So it's kind of a big question, but I'll actually start with books. And this is different depending on the topic because you guys know that I am fascinated with paganism as well as witchcraft and the occult and tarot, so I do have quite a lot of interests. But when I'm thinking about books, when it comes to certain branches of paganism, so for example, for Wicca, I would say my favorite book is Scott Cunningham's Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. Now, when it comes to traditional Wicca, I'd probably say my favorite book is Treading the Mill by Nigel Pearson. I would definitely recommend that for anyone who is new to traditional witchcraft. And then when it comes to paganism, I kind of feel like that's more of a tricky question because there are so many different branches of paganism, and I have different favorite books depending on which branch of paganism I am studying at the moment. For the most part, I do consider myself a Norse pagan, so in that vein, I would say that my favorite pagan books is the Havamal and the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. But it really does change depending on what I happen to be researching and learning about at the moment. So that's books. One thing I would mention is for fiction. I do have a favorite pagan-esque fiction book, which would be The Mists of Avalon. And I know that that is a controversial book because apparently the author turned out to be a horrible person. But that book did have a big importance and kind of the reason how I started to gravitate towards things like paganism. I read that book when I was a young teenager at around the same time I was getting interested in all of this stuff. So it definitely did have a big influence on my life. And if you are curious about more book recommendations, I did do a video I think a few months ago where I show you my whole book collection. So I will link that down below if you'd like to check that out. And let's see, so favorite movies. I don't really have any specific pagan movies in general, though I would say the movie Practical Magic, which is definitely more of a witchcraft movie than a pagan movie, but that movie really inspired me as a young teen as well and helped lead me down this path that I've ended up on. And the one thing I would mention is I do have several favorite pagan TV shows. The most recent season of The Last Kingdom just came out, and I am obsessed with that show. It does a great job of showing the tension and the differences between the Christian and the pagan worldview. So I'm just fascinated by that time period when the Vikings came to Britain and the kind of cross-cultural mixing that occurred. So I would definitely recommend that show. I also like the TV show Vikings, though I tend to find that it's a bit. This sounds horrible because I like violent movies, but I feel like the violence in the show Vikings is a bit gratuitous. So I kind of prefer The Last Kingdom, though I still definitely enjoyed the show Vikings. Let's see. Also, another great TV series I would recommend is Rome. This came out probably like a decade ago on HBO, and it shows what, life is like in ancient Rome. And it's a great way to kind of see what day-to-day life and experiences would be like if you lived in ancient Rome. And they do, of course, show a lot of the religious practices of the ancient Romans. So if you are a pagan that's interested in following the ancient Roman religious path, then I would definitely recommend checking out that TV show. Oh, and lastly, not too long ago, season 1 of The Witcher came out, and I totally binge watched that. So that was a really fun introduction to some of the folklore surrounding Slavic paganism. And I'm still a beginner when it comes to understanding Slavic paganism, but I am excited to learn more about this particular path. And I did do a video a few weeks ago about Slavic paganism, so I will link that down below if you are interested in learning as well. And lastly, for music, I'm kind of not the biggest follower of pagan bands. I probably should be better, but I do occasionally listen to pagan-inspired groups like Wardruna, Omnia, and Fawn, among a few others, but I'm probably not the best person to ask when it comes to pagan bands and pagan music. So for my next question, it comes from Leo's Cosmos from Instagram, and they ask, what deities do pagans worship? Are there any pagans who don't worship anything? And for that, I would say it really depends on what path you follow. So in terms of what deities do pagans worship, well, that depends. For example, say you are following the Hellenic path. You are a Hellenic pagan. So in that case, you worship the Greek gods, so Zeus and Hera and Aphrodite. Say you are following the Norse pagan path, well then you're working with the Norse gods such as Odin and Frigg and Freya and Thor. So it really depends on which path you are drawn towards. Now, some pagans just work with one pantheon of deities and one culture's traditions, while some pagans do tend to work with a couple pantheons in various cultures. So for me personally, I tend to work with the pagan religion of my ancestors. So I am Danish and Scotch-Irish. So I work with the Norse pagan deities and the Celtic pagan deities. So you don't have to follow the deities associated with your ancestry. You can follow whichever deities you feel drawn towards. But this is just what I personally practice. And yeah, so it really depends on what path you end up following. Now, as to his second question, are there any pagans who don't worship anything? Well, I consider paganism as building a connection with the gods. So if you don't worship anything, are you pagan? In my view, not really. Though I would just make a small note that even though he uses the word worship, I don't really consider what I do or what many pagans do as worship. I kind of view it more as forming a relationship with the deities. So you leave offerings and give thanks and petitions to the deities in hopes that they will bless your life and bring good things to you. So it's not like you're on the ground on your knees groveling before them. It's more of a relationship that you build and develop with the various gods. So I wouldn't necessarily use the word worship, but I do think you do need to have deity, multiple deities, as part of your personal practice in order for it to be considered pagan. Though that is just my personal opinion. So let's see, next question. So let's see, on Instagram, Blake Hennion asked, what is usually required for something to be listed under the umbrella of paganism? So everyone's going to have their own opinion on this because there's no rule book for paganism, really. My personal criteria for what is considered pagan is that it has to have multiple gods. To me, being pagans means to work with multiple deities. Secondly, I think it needs to be connected to or inspired from a pre-Christian society. So, for example, as a Norse and a Celtic pagan, I am looking back towards those societies and what they believed during those time periods, and I'm trying to glean and understand the traditions and the rituals that were performed so that I can bring them into the modern day. Now, most of the rituals and traditions you're not going to be able to necessarily bring exactly into the modern day, nor would you necessarily fully want to. But you want to at least be inspired by those traditions and take some of those core ideas and concepts into our modern lives. So I do think that a pagan religion needs to be in part inspired by the many pre-Christian societies that existed all over the world. And thirdly, I would say my last criteria is that there has to be some type of focus and incorporation of nature. You'll find in many pagan societies that nature was very much revered among people, and that natural items like plants and stones, and even the cycles of the seasons, for example, in the agricultural calendar, were a huge part of their faith. So those are the three things I would use to decide if a religion falls under that pagan umbrella. But again, this is just my opinion, and every pagan is entitled to their own. So here's an interesting question from Instagram from Monotheist Christians. Asks, as a pagan, do you believe in sin like the Abrahamic faiths? No, I definitely do not believe in the concept of sin or original sin. I do believe in morality. I believe that when we are born with an innate understanding of what is right and what is wrong, and that we can use philosophy and religion to help inspire us towards greatness and towards better moral decisions. But when I look at texts that do show us or gives us tips on how to live our best life, so a pagan example of that might be the Havamal, I don't view it as a text to prevent sin. Instead, I view it more as advice for living up to our fullest potential. So I do not believe in the concept of sin personally, and I think many pagans don't really believe in the concept of sin. I find it something that really differentiates the pagan worldview from the Christian or the other monotheistic religions' worldview. So the next question I have here is from Instagram from Catsnot, who asked, what turned you to paganism and how long ago? So I first became interested in paganism when I was around 13. So going back to that initial question, I was definitely inspired by the pop culture at the time. So I was inspired by movies like Practical Magic and The Craft, and inspired by books like The Mists of Avalon. So from, kind of getting slightly introduced to these ideas through pop culture, the next stage was going to the bookstore and buying some books on paganism. And at the time, it seemed that Wicca was really the thing. Wicca is still pretty popular, I would say, nowadays. So I bought some initial books on Wicca. And that is how I began my journey. I started with books like I mentioned, Scott Cunningham's Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, and his companion book, which is Living Wicca. And as I was reading those books, it just started to really click with me, because when I was a kid, ever since I was little, I had always felt a spiritual connection to nature. I loved hiking. I loved going on walks. I loved spending time outdoors, and I just didn't connect with the church experience at all. I felt that the natural world was my sacred space and the place that I could connect with the divine. So when I finally found out, hey, there's a whole religion of this, I was like, I'm sold, I'm in. So that was really kind of the start of it all. And over the years, I've learned more about paganism, and me personally, I've slowly started to shift a little bit away from Wicca and more towards Norse and Celtic paganism. But I definitely really appreciate Wicca, and I do still do some Wiccan traditions. And those of you that are familiar with my YouTube channel know that I do still celebrate all 8 Wiccan Sabbats. So yeah, I started when I was around 13 and I'm 31 now, so it's been quite a few years. And what turned me on to paganism was at first those initial pop culture witchy stuff, but then later on reading books and finally discovering Wicca and how I could turn my love of nature into a spiritual path. So yeah. So my next question here comes from my YouTube community page, and Catherine D asks, what do you think of taking on a pagan name for use in rituals and when interacting with other pagans? So I'm not sure if you guys know or thought about it, but Scarlet Ravenswood down here is actually not my legal name. It is my pagan name. So this is a name that I've used for over a decade. When I was a teenager, I did a self-dedication and naming ceremony. And this was the name that came to me, and I've been using it ever since. So I think it's awesome when people have a pagan name that they choose for themselves and that they choose to use when interacting with other pagans. Most people I know actually know me by the name Scarlet Ravenswood. And yeah, I would definitely recommend it if people feel called towards choosing a secondary name. It also makes sense kind of from an online perspective too, because I'm less likely to get like hate mail or my address found out or being doxxed if I had chosen to use my real legal name. So it's kind of nice not having to worry about that, making it a little bit more difficult for the haters to find out where I live, for example. But yeah, so Scarlet Ravenswood is my pagan name. So the last question I'll be answering today comes from my YouTube community page, and Paige Lucas asks, do you think it's possible to be both a Christian and a pagan, or are the two too contradictory to be practiced simultaneously? So this is different in my view depending on what perspective you're going with. So if you are coming from the Christian perspective, is it okay to be pagan and Christian? Absolutely not. Christians would not allow you to believe in other gods other than the one God. Now, from a pagan perspective, looking at it, it's kind of allowed because, I mean, first of all, there's no rule book in paganism, so you can kind of do what you want to a certain extent. And also, as pagans, we believe in many gods. So if you want to add on the Christian God onto your tray of other deities that you work with, then that's totally fine. And we do have examples of this from pagan societies. So like when Christianity was originally introduced, like Roman pagans tended to just tack on the Christian God as one of the many gods that they worked with. So in that way, it's kind of okay coming from a pagan perspective. However, I would say that the philosophy between paganism and Christianity is quite a bit different. Just like the example we talked about earlier, the belief in sin. So I do see a lot of significant philosophical and moral differences between a pagan worldview and a Christian worldview. So that would, I think, make it clash a little bit. But one of the great things about paganism is I'm not going to tell you what to do. There is no rule book. There is no governing bodies. So if that's what you feel called to do, then you should trust your instinct there. So I hope that helps answer your question a little bit. It is, of course, a complex issue, and I'm sure many people have different opinions on this. So I'm just sharing my own thoughts and ideas. So I hope you liked this video. Now, I know I wasn't able to tackle all of your questions, but let me know in the comments if you do like these Q&A style videos, and maybe I will do another one in the near future. And if you do enjoy this content and enjoy my channel, I do hope you will head over to my Patreon and consider joining my Patreon community. It's a place where I'm going to be creating additional content about paganism. So I do hope you will check that out and consider supporting the show. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.